Hi, welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight will be part one in an ongoing multi-part series. That series are my true crime book recommendations. I love to read. I'm always reading. I specifically love to read about true crime, of course. Every once in a while, I come across a book that is so good I can't help but talk about it. So I wanted to share these books with you guys. So tonight will be my top 10 true crime book recommendations. So let's go ahead and find out more. Let's go ahead and dive on in. The first true crime book that I recommend is The Phantom Prince by Elizabeth Kendall. This is about her life with Ted Bundy. She was with Ted while he was committing his various crimes. And it goes over her struggle in hearing about the infamous Ted that the police are looking for and wondering, could that be her boyfriend? And it goes through how she processed that, what did she do with that information, and how she coped with realizing her Ted was the Ted Bundy. The book also features part of Molly Kendall's story. Molly is Elizabeth's daughter, and she basically grew up with Ted as a father figure. And looking through things kind of in 2020 hindsight, she has a lot to say about her relationship with Ted from back at that time. So it is a fabulous, fabulous read. Great insight into how people viewed Ted before he became the infamous Ted Bundy. So definitely check that out. The second true crime book that I recommend is A Serial Killer's Daughter, My Story of Faith, Love, and Overcoming by Kerry Rawson. Kerry Rawson's father was Dennis Rader, the BTK serial killer. And this book goes through not so much the BTK killings, but her perspective of leading a absolutely normal life with an amazing family and an amazing father. And then one day the FBI knocks at your door and says, your father is the BTK serial killer and he's been arrested. Which is, she tries to put in words how she processed that and the struggles that she had since that exact moment. So again, it's about her story with having to realize that her father is the BTK serial killer. It is an amazing, amazing read. The strength that Kerry has to share her story and her struggles since finding that information out this is an amazing, amazing, amazing book. I cannot recommend it enough. I've actually gone to a few book clubs meetings where I've gone over this book. It is that good. It is so, so good. So definitely check that out. The next book that I recommend is one that's a little bit controversial, but it's the Unabombers Manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future by Ted Kaczynski. This is the exact manifesto that Ted Kaczynski put forward. When he wrote it, it was as the Freedom Club, but it was the manifesto that he wrote to the paper, which ultimately his brother and sister-in-law read and turned him in. The thing with his manifesto is it's a short read. It's under 100 pages, and it's a pretty simple read. When he gets into his concepts about how to handle society changing, that's when it goes a little to the left. But when you read how he views the world and how it should be, a lot of it makes sense. A lot of it makes sense. It's when he takes that turn to the left where you just can't get on board with it because it's atrocious and ultimately makes sense as to why he committed the crimes that he did, the horrific crimes that he did. But again, this is a really great read for those who, because we all know the name Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, but to read his writing, where it starts out and it gets more angry as the manifesto goes on. It's a really, really great read. So definitely check that out. the next book that I recommend, we're going back to Dennis Rader, the BTK serial killer. It is Confession of a Serial Killer, The Untold Story of Dennis Rader, BTK Killer by Catherine Ramsland, PhD. Catherine was able to work with the BTK killer, Dennis Rader, to get an extraordinary amount of interview time and get his words. So his words are in this book, as well as her, I would say, not interpretation, but her diagnoses of BTK. He was a very narcissistic individual. I mean, and that's just putting it lightly, but she really got to spend a lot of time, and she could see he was extremely manipulative. And as a PhD, she was able to see right through that, but she captures that in this book. So you get an idea of the BTK Dennis Rader that he wanted people to see, as well as getting things in his words, where those moments that he didn't really want captured in front of the camera. So it's a really good read to get a sense of what he's thinking. One thing with this, I would say, is read it with a grain of salt, because with any killer who has a narcissistic personality disorder, as well as you add on a whole slew of other disorders that they have, a lot of it is, can you take everything he said as truth? Because there are so many lies. You can't. And Catherine Ramsland, explains that as well. But it still gives you a bit of an insight. So I think it's really, really worthwhile. So check that out. The next book that I would recommend is not necessarily a true crime book, but it does go over a lot of crimes. And let me explain. It is Season of the Witch by David Talbot. This book is really informative. It's a long read. It's almost 450 pages about San Francisco during the time of the peace, love, and hippie movement, just before that, during that, and the aftermath into the 80s. The reason that I got this book was for the Manson Saga discussion panel. I'm a co-host on that on the podcast. And there's a little part in here about the Manson case. And the Manson case typically gets known as those murders ending the summer of love. And that's just not the case. It's mentioned in here, but in the tiniest part. There was so much else going on in San Francisco during that time that led to that movement ending. And it goes through that. Every single chapter here could be a book on its own. It is so incredibly well written and detailed. And there were a lot of things in history reading this that I didn't even know had happened. Some examples that you can expect in this book are Harvey Milk, Jim Jones, yes, the Jim Jones from Jonestown, and the band's Grateful Dead, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, that whole movement of music. Everything is related, and it goes through kind of where that started to build in San Francisco and what ultimately ended it. So check this out. It's a really great read. Even if you're not into true crime, you're going to love this book. If you're a history buff, you will love it. Again, Season of the Witch by David Talbot. The next true crime book that I recommend is Chaos. Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s by Tom O'Neill. For those who don't know, the Helter Skelter book by Vincent Bugliosi captures, as he says, why the Manson murders occurred. It's bullshit. It's just flat out bullshit. So a lot of authors have come forward to put in, there's different theories about to why the Manson murders had occurred in the first place. Tom O'Neill is one of those authors. The book, I would say, is to almost break up into two parts. The first half of this book, Tom does a phenomenal job of debunking the Helter Skelter theory by Vincent Bugliosi, completely discrediting it. And this is a long read, so there's a lot of proof that he has to show why that whole motive is bullshit. So you get through that part of the book. The second part is his theory of why the case occurred. CIA and MK Ultra. So again, that is one theory as he's putting forward as to why the crimes had started. So check this out. It's a great read. The only disclaimer I would have is if you're not terribly familiar with the Manson case, a lot of the lesser known names are really discussed in this book. So you have to have a bit of a knowledge about the case and the not so major players in the case to follow the structure of the second half of the book. But once you do, it's easier to follow, and it's a really great read. The footnotes that he has, like in the back, there's a whole note section. That itself could be a book. It's so informative. And if you download the audiobook of this, you don't get those notes. So to get it in print, so worth it. So check that out. The next true crime book that I recommend is The Black Dahlia Red Rose, True Crime, the Crime, Corruption, and Cover-Up of America's Greatest Unsolved Murder by Q. Ewell. This was a recommendation by my co-host Paul from the Paulcast Manson Saga discussion panel. It has nothing to do with Manson, but he read this and said, Danny, you're going to love it. So I bought it, read it, and he was not wrong. This is, I would say, hands down, the best book in putting out who most likely committed the Black Dahlia murder. Again, it is still technically considered an unsolved case, but the research that this author does, I left this book with a pretty good understanding of, I think I know who committed the crime. And you will get that from this book. So definitely check it out, again, because there are so many theories as to who killed the Black Dahlia. But this, I think, really, really hits a home run on this. So definitely check this out. The next true crime book that I recommend is I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara. And this is about her search for the Golden State Killer. The Golden State Killer has been caught and is arrested. But this book started her research prior to that happening. Sadly, Michelle McNamara passed away before the Golden State Killer was captured, but her husband, who is a famous actor, talks in the very end of the book about, and basically finishes it for her, how D'Angelo was caught and how his wife would have, she put so much into trying to figure out who this was. And there's just one section in here that you're going to be in tears reading. I was in tears reading. I don't want to give too much away if you haven't read the book, because I know the capture of the Golden State Killer it's a few years old, but it's still relatively new considering compared to some other true crime cases that happened several decades ago. But this is a great, great book. And this was, again, recommended to me by my co-host Paul from the Paulcast. And great, great book. Great read. So definitely check that out, especially if you don't know a ton about the Golden State Killer. I did not before reading this book. I knew a little bit of the case and a little bit of him because I heard he'd been caught, but I didn't know the full background. And this really, really gave it. So good read. The next true crime book that I recommend is by Anne Rule, Small Sacrifices. This is a book about Diane Downs. I recently covered Diane Downs, that case, on my show, Danny After Dark. And this book was really, really helpful in going through and getting a very, very deep understanding of the case and why it happened. There was so much more I would have wanted to capture in the episode I did on Diane Downs, but it would have had to been a multi-part. But I gave you guys just the gist, but this book gets into so much more, especially at the trial. The trial section in this is a very, very long section, but it's so detailed and it really gives you an idea of what the jury saw while she was on trial. This book it's a tiny book, but it's pretty big. It's just under 500 pages, but it's a really, really, really good story. And it captures, sadly, the the crimes that anytime there's children involved, it's just horrific. And especially when somebody tries to take the life of their own children. So check this out if you can stomach it. Again, not everybody can read about that. Sometimes, again, crimes involving children are a little touchy. So if that's not for you, then I do not recommend this. But for those of you who can get through that, check this out. Last, number 10 in my true crime book recommendations in part 1 is, now this is a big book, The Manson File, Myth and Reality of an Outlaw Shaman by Nicholas Schreck. So Nicholas is a friend of the Manson Saga discussion panel, and he has been on several times for interviews with us, which we are beyond grateful to be able to pick his brain about the case. This is a follow-up edition to a book that he had already put out. And this is, we joke about it almost like it's a textbook, because it really is. You could take a college course on this book. It is huge, and it is just under 400 pages. This goes into, again, there are multiple theories with the Manson case. And this goes into Nicholas Schreck's theory on the case. And Nicholas was also good friends with Charles Manson before Manson passed away. So you really get that inside perspective as well of Nicholas's relationship with Manson. This is not a quote unquote true crime book, if you will. It does touch upon the murders in regards to Nick's theory and how he goes to present that. But it's really, it touches on everything. It touches on everything about the case. And I can't recommend it enough, but it's not in, this is not a read where you sit and you're like, oh, I can have the TV on and, have dinner cooking while I kind of read through. No, this is one where you really have to sit and focus and read, even if you're familiar with the case. It's so detailed. Everything Nicholas does is intentional. So every paragraph is packed with information. Every page packed with information. So you get 10 pages in and you think, oh my God, what did I just read? Because you just get hit with so much in a great way. So this will take you a little bit longer to read, but it's a really, really great book. And he just released it. So it is in the process of being shipped to people who had pre-ordered it. But if you go to his site, you can check it out to try to get one for yourself. And I can't recommend it enough. And Nicholas was actually even kind enough to sign mine for me, which was amazing. So again, Manson File, Myth and Reality of an Outlaw Shaman by Nicholas Schreck. So thank you for sticking around for another episode of Danny After Dark, and especially one about books where I get to kind of nerd out because, again, I cannot stress enough how much I love to read. So I hope you guys got something out of this. If you have read any of these books and have any comments or your own thoughts on them, leave a comment below. If there's any true crime books that you recommend that I should read, leave a comment below and I will check that out. There have been so many suggestions that viewers from the show, as well as viewers from our Manson Saga discussion panel, have messaged to us saying, I really think you'd like this book. And chances are I'll buy it because, again, I just love to read. And there's been some really, really great recommendations. So keep them coming. Let's be interactive about this. Knowledge is power. And, especially with winter going to be coming in the next few months, the more books I have piled up to read, the better. Anyway, thank you for sticking around. And until next time, remember, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us.